Hey guys, Jasensational here. And before we get into the video, I just want to wish everyone out there very happy holidays and a happy new year. I know it's a very different situation this year, and I hope that everyone's doing well. But with that out of the way, I have a little bit of a different video than what you're probably used to seeing on YouTube for Legends of RuneTerra. And as a person who's always played card games for fun, I played Hearthstone a couple of years, and then I transitioned to RuneTerra earlier this year, and have been playing ever since. But because I always played for fun, I was kind of surprised when I was able to go so far in the Monuments of Power seasonal tournament, placing in the top 16. And especially the fact that it was the first tournament I've ever played in, or any card game at a competitive level. And so I've received this question a few times, being, how exactly do you get better at RuneTerra? How were you able to play at a high competitive level on your first try, for example? And so I thought I'd share my thinking process with all of you. And then after that, we'll jump into some of the tournament games I have recorded from the top 32 performance that we'll go through and apply the framework together. This is a little bit of a different video than probably what you're used to, so if you do enjoy what you see, please drop a like and a subscribe or a comment just to let me know what I've done. Again, I put in a lot of effort into creating this video, and so I hope that you all enjoy. So there are 5 things to consider when going into every game you play, and if you do this for every game, I guarantee you that you'll be a better player. And these 5 things are knowing your own deck, knowing your opponent's deck, identifying who the aggressor is, hand reading, and drawing better than your opponent. And we'll go into each of these points more in depth. So the first 3 things can be thought about even as you're queuing into a game. When the loading screen begins and you see who you're up against, these are kind of like the things that you should be thinking about in your head. Let's take a look at this example right here. We have me playing Yasuo Katarina versus a Tahm Raka deck. Now, when I'm talking about knowing a deck, I'm mainly referring to how it will win games in certain matchups. Yasuo Katarina can play a very controlling game with some of its stun cards, opting to play for Yasuo to remove the enemy minions, or you can play a very aggressive game plan with quick attackers and bigger minions to capitalize on Katarina's rally. Tahm Raka, on the other hand, mainly wins through leveling Star Spring and controlling the board with Tahm Kench. Now, on occasion, they could sneak wins by with really big Star Shepherds, but that's only far in between. Now, it's important to understand that the win conditions may change with certain decks depending on the matchup. Take this particular matchup, for example. If I, the Yasuo Katarina player, tries to play for a slow, controlling game plan without developing much pressure onto my opponent, the Tahm Kench player will have an advantage because in my deck, I have no ways of removing his Star Spring. And so as the game drags on longer and longer, I give my opponent more time to win through the Star Spring level up option. And so in this matchup, I can't be playing for a control game plan with this deck. I have to be opting for my aggressive strategy of beating my opponent down with quick attackers and big minions. And now this intuitively makes me the aggressor in this matchup. The last thing to consider is the cards that you have to play around, and these will usually be spells or combat tricks that will dictate how you attack and how you use your removal. And they have to be thought about. It's so important because throughout the game, there could be potential breakpoints that really decide who wins or loses a game if you don't play around a certain card or you commit a removal and they have a way to play around it. Now, in this particular matchup, the cards I'm looking out for are Guiding Touch, Pale Cascade, Hush, Astral Protection, and Bastion. Now, since the games that I will be talking about and showing you later are from the seasonal tournament, which was an open decklist format, it is much easier to know what to play around and what exactly is in my opponent's deck. However, even on ladder, if you're facing against a meta deck, you can find very descriptive deck lists online at Mobalytics. Or for example, Alternatively, after playing for a while, you'll realize that each region has their own combat tricks that are often played in most decks. Take Targon, for example. You'll find that most decks in Targon are running Pale Cascade, and you'll find that most decks in Freljord are running Troll Chant. So those are just some very common examples of cards that you can think about when you're facing a matchup they don't quite know what's inside their deck. And now on to my next point, which is why is knowing the aggressor so important? Especially in RuneTerra, it's all because of the initiative system. And this is also the reason why control decks can be so powerful in this game. A control deck can pass on their turn to let the opponent play first. And then once their opponent commits their mana into developing the board or playing a spell, they can then choose how they want to use the removal and play reactively. Or if the opponent passes back and tries to burn mana on both sides, the control deck is often happy because the longer the game goes on, the higher probability that the control deck wins. And mana burned is often more valuable to the aggressor than to the control deck. Now, if you're playing an aggro deck versus a control deck, there isn't much consideration because you're always the aggro deck and they're always a control deck. And the way aggro decks are usually constructed, your game plan doesn't change much because you're always trying to play proactively. You have to play your minions on curve and you have to play efficiently in order to beat down your opponent before the game drags on too long. However, this issue is more pertinent when you're, say, playing a control deck versus another control deck. Uh, let's be clear about one thing. In a control deck mirror, there will always still be an aggressor. Even if your deck isn't built to be an aggressive deck, one deck will always have more late game value than the other, which means that if both players are trying to play for a controlled game plan, the one with the more late game value will usually always win. Even if you're playing exactly the same deck list. Say you're playing an Aethel mirror, and one player draws Aethel, but the other doesn't. Then it's pretty clear who's going to win in this situation if the game drags on too long. And for that reason, the person who didn't draw Aethel has to be the one to race down the opponent before it gets too late. And by thinking about who's being the aggressor and who is the control deck, this will significantly change your mindset and your strategy. Even as a control deck, you'll be forced to play proactively for board and for tempo as the aggressor. And it's an important mindset to realize early on in order to get chip damage in the first few rounds of the turn. Because if you don't realize that you're the aggressor in this matchup, that's a really big misplay in itself. And I can't stress that enough. You could lose outright if you don't play aggressively, thinking that you can win in the long run. And the same can be somewhat said for an aggro deck mirror. In this case, instead of thinking who has the more late game value, we're thinking of which deck is faster than the other. Now, if you are the slower deck, you have to prioritize playing for board and for tempo, which means that you can't always be going for face damage as much. Because if you try to race a faster deck than you, you're just letting that down to probability of who has better draws, and it's more likely that their deck is built around a way that can burn you out faster than you can beat them. And that's why really knowing who the aggressor is so important. Now, once the game actually starts, it's time to begin hand reading. And while after a certain point you can read what kind of minions and spells your opponents have in hand, at first it's very important just to start with the combat tricks and removal cards. Oops, sorry about that. Using the previous example, we've identified 5 cards that we need to be careful of at any point in the game, being Guiding Touch, Hush, Pale Cascade, Astral Protection, and Bastion. Once we have done so, the next step is to be wary of how much mana the opponent has each turn. So you're looking at how much mana the opponent has at the end of each turn before you want to commit to an attack or a removal spell. So let's say the opponent has 3 mana remaining. We know that he doesn't have the mana to play Astral Protection or Bastion this turn. That means for that particular turn, the only cards that we have to worry about are Guiding Touch, Hush, and the Pale Cascade. But note that this doesn't necessarily rule out that they don't have an Astral Protection or Bastion in hand. You'll just have to wait for a moment when they have 4 mana to really test them and know what they have. But that does mean that because they can't play these cards, then you don't have to play around them, because obviously they're tapped under using Bastion or Astral Protection this turn. Another way to infer their hand state is to kind of see how much mana they're floating at the end of each turn. If the opponent is constantly passing their turns with 4 mana up, then it's possible that they have an Astral or Bastion in hand that they want to play reactively, or a combination of other 2-cost spells. For example, they could have 2 Guiding Touches, or a Pale and a Guiding, or any of the combination. So now that we've tracked what cards that we need to play around, how exactly can we rule out what cards aren't in their hand? Say your opponent has 2 mana up now, and we threaten their 3 health Raka with a Ravenous Flock. Raka has 6 health, and the Ravenous Flock deals 4 damage to a damaged minion, meaning that the damaged Raka at 3 health will die to the Ravenous Flock. Now, if they let the Ravenous Flock go through, even though they have 2 mana up, I can safely assume that they don't have a Guiding Touch in hand. However, that doesn't rule out them not having a Pale Cascade in hand, but playing the Pale Cascade in that situation wouldn't have protected the Soraka, and the opponent probably wouldn't have opted to make that play just to potentially draw a card. But ultimately, that's kind of a risky play, because if the opponent did have a Guiding Touch, we'd have no other way of dealing with Soraka, and then she attacks next turn and heals her health back, and we would have been really punished by our play. We can't actually put ourselves in that situation where we're risking them not to have a card like Guiding Touch in their hands, because that could blow us out from that situation by burning a Ravenous Flock and not killing a minion with it. And so this is a desperation play in some cases, because there's a chance that they do have the Guiding Touch, and we would be really punished by it. But if we're playing for a situation where we're kind of forced to remove this Raka from the board, and they don't happen to have a Guiding Touch, then we would be rewarded for our risk. And this is kind of the basic concept to hand reading and bluffing, which would make a lot more sense as we go into some of our games that I'll talk about in more detail. And so the following games I have pulled from my top 32 tournament run, which I will be applying the 5-step framework to. And for those who really want to deepen their understanding to some of the concepts that I've covered in this video so far, I suggest that you follow along in your head or on a notepad, and I'll be including the links to my deck lists that I'll be playing, so you know what cards are in my deck. Now, unfortunately, I was going to pull the deck lists from my opponents that I played, but I can't really find them. So just treat this as if you're on ladder, and these would be the typical cards that your opponent could be running in perhaps unknown quantities. So let's just get started off with what I think is a relatively straightforward matchup. For our first game here, we're playing an Ionia Freljord Field of Rush deck against a Targon Vimer deck. For our deck, we're aiming to ramp quickly and play big threats like Trundle and Tryndamere and our Field of Rush card. While the Vimer deck, on the other hand, is looking to control the game and then drop their big invoke minions in late turns. Intuitively is the fact that, or rather unintuitively, I would say, is the fact that I would say that the Field of Rush deck is actually the aggressor here. People think that often a deck that relies on playing a 12-cost spell would be the epitome of a slow control deck. But while this is true in many instances, the Vimer deck itself has very little aggression. And once we get to our Field of Rush turn, we're instantly the aggressor, because now we're facing down the board with 20 points of damage. And in a very, very drawn out matchup, the Vimer deck could actually invoke cards like a Fallen Comet to kill our Tryndamere, or they get a Supernova off of Star Shaping that just absolutely counters our Field Rush and can be a blowout. And so although we don't develop early threats, we're kind of on a clock here because if the game drags out too long and they get their invoke cards that really counter our threats, then it's a really hard spot to come back from. Otherwise, their deck is mostly a standard PNC control deck. If you remember Vimer from a couple of expansions ago, then it's still a very similar story. They're running cards like Thermo Beam, Mystic Shot, and Get Excited, and sometimes they get some invoke cards from Solari Priestess or Star Shaping, which often they're looking for obliterates in this position. All right, so let's jump into our first matchup here, which is our Feel the Rush deck versus their Vimer deck. Again, starting with a mulligan, because they're such a slow deck and that they don't have much early aggression, I like keeping as voices of the old ones just to kind of really ramp up my game plan and hit my Feel the Rush on as soon as I can. And then keep an Aberration Trapper just because I think it's such a good card against any matchup. Hitting a 1 mana 5/5 on turn 4 can really act as a really good blocker to transition me into the late game if he does have an early curve. And this Trundle and Catalyst can, they're good cards to have as well, which I'm pretty happy about this current starting hand in Mulligan. Just a general guide. I do feel pretty favored coming into this matchup. His deck lacks a lot of hard removal, and the hard removal that he does have access to are through invokes, and it's not guaranteed that he'll get them. One of the big things in this matchup is, of course, getting to my Field of Rush as soon as possible, which I do have in hand. So right now, the main thing I'm thinking about, independent to what my opponent is doing, is when is the soonest I can get to my Field of Rush play. I have this catalyst of Aeons, and I have the voices of the old ones, and I'm figuring out how I want to spend my mana and when I can play my Field of Rush. So next turn I'll have 8 mana, so I definitely want to play Voices of the Old Gods, which would put me to 7 mana crystals, and then the following turn I'd have 8 mana crystals. And then I'd bank 3 mana there, and the turn after that I'll have enough to play my Field of Rush. So the important thing here is I need to bank 3 spell mana going into next turn. Luckily, he actually develops his board, so I have time to play this 1 mana Yeti, and that gives me a good blocker on board. And this also occurs really nicely into my second Trapper because I can only spend 4 mana this turn, so I can play out the Yeti and the Trapper on this turn, and have 8 mana for Voices on the following turn. Again, I'm always gonna play Voices this turn, and so I'm just thinking about whether or not I want to commit to this open attack here. There's it's debatable whether or not I need to go for this open attack. I don't really need to get in this chip damage right now because I'll have a lot of big overwhelm units in the late game, and dealing 3 or 5 damage now isn't the biggest priority. But now let's also think about his hand, because I think this is a really interesting play from our opponent. At first, he blocks the Yeti, which seems reasonable, but then he shifts to blocking the Aberration Trapper. I'm thinking that he might have like a Mystic Shot or a Get Excited here in order to deal with the Yeti, and take this trade here because I have no mana, so I can't play a card like Troll Chant in order to stop his block here. And when he actually doesn't have anything, I'm thinking he could have like a Thermo Beam with a Vi being 5 mana, leaving him with 2 mana to Thermo Beam. And then he'd have a really good open attack with a potentially buffed up Vi. Now he does neither of this, which which I'm starting to think about what his hand state could be. There's no Thermo Beam, there's no Mystic Shot, and there's no Get Excited. Otherwise, he would have used them during combat in order to save himself 5 health from the Yeti. So his hand is likely something like a Heimerdinger. There still could be a Thermo Beam, but he didn't play this turn. Or there could be a Bastion or a Static Shock. So those are kind of the things I'm thinking about are in his hand. And now he plays his first Invoke minion, so let's really keep track of what he gets from it. He's definitely looking for one of his Obliterate cards, being Falling Comet, which is a 6-mana Obliterate. The good news for me is that I don't really have to worry about it too much, because once I play Field Rush, you can only get rid of one big threat here. Now, I haven't completely ruled out Thermo Beam from his hand, so this Trundle could get killed on board, but he knows that I do run Troll Chant in my deck, and so he can't always commit to a Thermo Beam here. And even if he did commit to the Thermo Beam here, I'm looking to play Field Rush on the following turn. And if I had Trundle in hand, it would pull the Trundle from my hand first before pulling it from the deck. And in this case, I really want to prioritize pulling a Trundle from my deck, because I don't really want to be drawing into one. And now, this next block is also kind of interesting. I have the option to block with Trundle to this Mountain Goat here, because I have the read that he doesn't have a Mystic Shot, Get Excited, or any of the sort, because he didn't remove the Yeti on the last turn. But if he was saving it for this exact instance where he could kill my Trundle, I don't want that to happen, because right now he can't Thermo Beam my Trundle at 4 mana. And so I'm playing around all of his removal cards, and on my turn, I get to open with the Ice Pillar, which he can't stop me from leveling my Trundle. And then, when I have exactly 12 mana to play my Field Rush, I also pull a leveled up Trundle from my deck, which is really huge, because granting the Overwhelm to Trundle is just so insanely strong. And so we remember that he has one Invoke card, which is, potentially a Falling Comet. But given the current board state and him having to spend 6 mana to play Falling Comet against this Field Rush, he's in a really bad position right now. And if we remember his hand from earlier, because he didn't have any sort of removal, I'm thinking that his hand is currently really clunky cards like a Heimer, Static Shock, or Bastion that really don't do anything here. So even though we have a pretty decent read of what's in his hand, it's not so important against our current game plan here. We're always playing Field Rush. He doesn't have access to a card like Deny or anything like that in order to make this Field Rush not the play this turn. And so he did have the Falling Comet from his Solari Priestess, and he actually chooses to obliterate the Trundle here, I believe. Yeah, or sorry, the Tryndamere. And, while killing the Tryndamere with the Obliterate obviously prevents it from leveling up and is theoretically more value, these Trundles are just dealing a lot more damage this turn because of the boost that they're getting. And from this moment, he doesn't really have any way of stopping it. Even though he had the Falling Comet, he was just a little too slow in this matchup. And that being said, we also had a really strong hand where we were able to ramp with Voices of the Old Gods into this power turn. And, I'm dealing 25 damage through his defenders, and he can't do much about it. So a relatively simple matchup here. So I went over the basic rundown of this matchup at the beginning of the video, but just to iterate some of the key points I made earlier, as the Yasuo Katarina player, I definitely have to be the aggressor against Tahm Raka and Starspring, because eventually, if I give them too much time, Starspring will level up before I can beat him. And I can't commit against cards like Pale Cascade, Guiding Touch, Hush, Astral Protection, and Bastion in this matchup. And again, for our second matchup here with our Yasuo Katarina deck, we are the aggressor against this Tahm Raka. So the main cards I'm looking for here is Blade Twirler and Katarina, which is kind of the 2-card combo that really enables us to apply a lot of pressure early on against this deck. These stun cards don't really help us accomplish that because he doesn't really have big minions to threaten our life total. And so keeping these stuns in the early game is actually quite bad. And so it's a pretty easy full mulligan here. Unfortunately, we don't find what we're looking for, but we do find Nopeify and Deny, which can be really good in this matchup to prevent some of our units from being captured by Tahm Kench. Now we see this Katarina draw, which is really good for us. Really happy about it because we get it as soon as we could. And the important thing to note from our opponent is that he does have Star Spring on curve. And so we're really limited time-wise as to when we need to kill him, because we need to kill him obviously before he has the opportunity to win with Star Spring. And so we want to play pretty proactively here. We drop Katarina on curve, and knowing that he doesn't really have a way of dealing with it here. Now, the only potential way he could kill my Katarina here is with a Hush combined with a Pale Cascade onto his Star Shepherd here. And even though he doesn't do it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not in his hand range. It's still a little early to say. So we get the level up on Katarina, which is good. The unfortunate thing here is that we have no minions to really capitalize on Katarina's rally. So this is a really tricky turn. I don't necessarily want to float my 4 mana here, but I don't want to attack my Katarina into the Tahm Kench so that he can start healing it with the Star Spring. And so kind of a really weird play here is that I just opt to play Katarina down on board and just not attack with it. This kind of provides a blocker in case I need one. It has a potential to block a Star Shepherd if he gets 1 heal off, buffing it to a 2/3. And it might prevent an attack from him. The main card that he's looking out from my side is Flock. So he doesn't want to be recklessly attacking into a Ravenous Flock into a case where he might not be able to protect his main units. And so I finally draw a Fey Blade Twirler, which is really good here. Because that allows me to start scaling my minions with Katarina and start applying pressure here. The only scary part here is that if he plays his the capture card Acquire Taste this turn, I probably have to protect my Fey Blade Twirler because it's my only minion. And if he, removes it from the board, I have no pressure with just a Katarina. And so he actually plays Shakedown, which is kind of surprising. Maybe he has a Pale Cascade in order to kill my Fey Blade Twirler. He doesn't open with the Pale Cascade, so I'm pretty happy to let this go through because his deck has no way of dealing 1 damage to my Fey Blade Twirler. And if I play a card, he could have the Pale Cascade in response, which I wouldn't want that. Now, very, what's the word? It was very good for me, at least, that he spent 1 mana playing Shakedown, because what this means is that if he spent 2 more mana on the Acquired Taste, he wouldn't have a way to protect the Tahm Kench from a Ravenous Flock. So his play actually was probably a misplay there, and actually benefited me quite well. Now, we still don't really have much of a hand read on his cards, but the main important thing to note here is that he didn't have a Soraka, which is one of the key cards in his deck that allows him to really draw through his deck in order to get the tools to protect his units. And now, so this turn he goes for the Acquired Taste because now he has the mana to use tools like Bastion and Astral Protection to protect his Tahm from a Ravenous Flock. And like I said again, I think the Fey Blade Twirler is just too important of a card in this matchup. So I opt to use this Notify to protect it. And what this also does is that, it prevents it prevents him the ability to start getting value off of healing his Tahm Kench. But I mean, he can still do the same here as he chooses to block with it. Even though I have 1 mana to represent Flock, he has 6 mana to represent Astral Protection, which is most likely in his hand. The reason I know that is because when his Tahm Kench goes down to 2 health here, and he has 6 mana left, if he didn't have the Astral Protection and only had like a Guiding Touch, then the Ravenous Flock would still kill the Tahm Kench. Now he could have something like a Guiding Touch and another Guiding Touch, or a Guiding Touch and a Pale Cascade, which would save his Tahm Kench from a Flock, or having a Bastion here. So he's pretty safe to take this Flock. But that doesn't really narrow down what his hand range is. We just know that he has cards in his hand that would deal with Flock. So in the case if I did have a Ravenous Flock in this hand, I can never use it to threaten the Tahm Kench here. And now, going back to the gameplay here. We see that he did have a Guiding Touch here, which he uses to save his Broadback Protector from the next turn, and, also starts progressing his Star Spring a little bit further. Now, we do have the leveled up Katarina, so each turn is just a decision of whether or not we want to play the Katarina and start pressuring him. The scary part is that he does have these Star Shepherds, which are looking a little scary and kind of prevent attacks from our minions that don't have quick attack. And so this Yasuo here is actually really important because combined with the Minotaur Reckoner, I can start removing some of his minions. And we see that he did have an Astral Protection, which he uses to buff up his Tahm Kench here so that he can challenge this Fade Blade Twirler, which I think he does in a few seconds here. And so he actually starts with the Acquired Taste. Now, because I draw the Yasuo, and this Minotaur Reckoner is one of my only few stun cards that I have active, I think that protecting this Minotaur Reckoner is actually quite important. And so I'm really thinking about using this Deny here, because I'm thinking about how many turns I have left before I need to win, and how many more cards that I actually need to use this Deny on. And so it's a little bit of a harder concept to really grasp and think about, but I'm thinking that I need to close this game out in maybe like 3 or 4 more turns, depending on how fast I can get his Star Spring online. And so I think combined with the Yasuo here, I think this Minotaur Reckoner is a little too important to have. And so I opt to use the Deny to save my Reckoner here. And now we don't really have, the only thing that we could use to stop or protect our units here is a Steel Tempest, but that would stop us from playing Yasuo this turn. And I think that Yasuo with the Minotaur Reckoner is a little bit too important to have down on this turn. And so that we just give up any way of protecting our units. And because he used the Astral Protection on the Tahm Kench here, and that I tapped under Ravenous Flock mana, he feels pretty safe using this Tahm Kench to trade into my Fade Blade Twirler. And I block one of these Star Shepherds with my Sentry. And, he could have like a Pale Cascade or something like that to protect these Star Shepherds, but that really doesn't affect me too much. So he does. So again, our opponent uses the Pale Cascade here to save his Broadback Protector from killing itself, which also gives him an additional heal from Star Spring. And so let's take a look at Star Spring. It's at 11, meaning I think that's halfway. And so just keeping track of how far the Star Spring is along kind of represents how much time we have left in order to end this game out. So what's the play here? We could obviously play Katarina twice and attack with Yasuo and Katarina to try to pressure down some of his units, but the danger of having Hush on our opponent's side is a little bit too risky of a play here, and we can't really give up our Yasuo here because it's really helping to apply pressure to our opponent's board. And these Star Shepherds, importantly, actually prevent us from attacking with our Yone and Minotaur Reckoner here, because I don't want to offer such bad trades, or rather, I want to keep my board as much as possible. And so I actually opt to kill these Star Shepherds with the Yone, because if those die, then he can't be blocking with his Broadback Protector or his Tahm Kench against these 6/6s. And the only way to protect his Star Shepherds is either using a Bastion or an Astral Protection, because this Yasuo is dealing 5 damage to each of them. And what's also really good is that if he wastes any of his resources protecting his Star Shepherds, that's resources that could have gone to protecting his Tahm Kench. Now, he does commit a Bastion here, which saves one of his Star Shepherds. Now I have a decision to make. What do I attack with? I'm definitely taking an attack this turn because I still need to be pressuring him out of this game. I could attack with my Yasuo, but again, he could still have the threat of Hush in hand. And I offer this Yone to trade with his Star Shepherd because once his Star Shepherd's gone, he really has no effective blockers against my board, and so the threat of something like a Hush really goes down. And he actually doesn't block here, which is a little bit surprising to me. Uh, I guess he doesn't trade off it in order to get additional heal from his Star Spring. And again, he uses another Sunblessed Vigor to protect his Broadback Protector again. Now he's at 15, but he's down to 3 cards in hand, with one being an Acquired Taste. And this is kind of where things get a little tricky. Well, now he has 3 cards with the draw. He only needs 7 more healing in order to win. And so I'm feeling pretty pressured to start applying some attacks with my Katarina Rally. And, I'm not afraid of trading off his Katarina to his Boxtopus because I have a second Katarina in hand. And if he trades off his Boxtopus, he stops getting heal points from his Star Spring into it, which is also very valuable. And now, of course, he also kind of wants to represent lethal, so he offers up the attack. And so I opt to block with Yone. I hovered over my Steel Tempest, thinking if I wanted to save the Katarina here, but I wanted to play more reactively in case he decided to Astral Protection his Boxtopus, and then I could save my Katarina by stunning it this turn. And now that he has no blockers on board because I killed his big Star Shepherd, I can attack freely with whatever I want. And again, looking at his Star Spring, he's at 15 out of 22 with 2 cards in hand. We know that the Star Spring will heal by the Tahm Kench by 1, going up to 18. And we have the attack token next turn. And so it's actually looking pretty good for us. His hand range is pretty limited. he actually doesn't block anything here. And we see that one of his cards is actually a Star Spring, if I'm correct. Yeah, which is a pretty dead card here. And so I feel pretty comfortable jamming my second Katarina here and getting another attack. And this is so he actually did have a second Astral Protection in hand this whole time, which he could have used earlier in some more favorable positions, but he actually uses it here to heal up his Tahm in order to taunt my Yasuo here, which actually puts him to 21 out of 22 in his Star Spring after this round, which means that he's guaranteed to win next turn if I don't kill him. But he's at 6 health, and he's staring down this Minotaur Reckoner that he's forced to block. And the following turn, I can play Katarina twice more. And this Minotaur Reckoner is stunning this Tahm Kench the following turn, so he can't even use it as a blocker. And so a very close game that came down to it. What's really interesting in this game is that me and my opponent were playing around cards that potentially weren't in our hands, but we can never risk the fact that it could potentially be. Now, in the third game, I am playing my Targon Heimer deck versus what is a pretty standard Fiora Shen list. In this matchup, we have a reversal of roles where I'm playing the Targon Heimer deck as a very controlled game plan against Fiora Shen. The main goal here is to remove all of his units and prevent his Fiora win con. The way Fiora Shen is constructed, a lot of their spells are used to protect their units. And so if I'm able to defeat or remove all of their units from the board, then they often have a very bricked out hand with lots of spells and no units to play it on. And so the game plan is pretty simple, but Fiora Shen is one of the most intense hand reading matchups because they have so many spells that are meant to protect their units. And so for each turn, I'll go into very key details of what I'm scared of and what cards I need to play around. And these most typically are cards like Sharp Sight, Riposte, Fiora's Riposte to an extent, Shen's Stand United, Spirit's Refuge, and some of the more removal spells like Single Combat and Concerted Strike. So as we get into the matchup, something I just want to preface how exactly the game will go. So again, I mentioned earlier that our goal is to use our removal spells to pick off all of their units. And when all they have no more units, they can't use their spells anymore. So very importantly, for every removal card we play, we want to be trading one card per one unit. And this is really important because if they use one spell from their side to protect their unit from one of our removal spells, and we spend our removal and don't remove the unit, then we're kind of behind from that exchange. It's something really interesting to think about, especially in a matchup against Fiora Shen. And so when we come up to this first minion that he plays, which is a Fleetwing Tracker, I have the option to spend this Mystic Shot to remove it. Now, Mystic Shot doesn't really have too many hits later on in the game. There are very few units that 2 damage actually kills. And so this might be one of the only units I can kill in this matchup. However, I decide against it because he's at 2 mana. And very importantly, at 2 mana, they have access to a Sharp Sight, which is pretty much a direct counter to my Mystic Shot. And if I exchange my Mystic Shot for his Sharp Sight here, not only does that leave his unit up, he deals an extra 2 damage this turn. And even if he didn't have the Sharp Sight here, I can still use a Mystic Shot later on to pop a barrier, which could be really important. Now, I'm kind of thinking about if I want to play a 3-drop here, but I have no good discard targets for my Sump Dredger, and if I play Solari Priestess into a Fiora, which he does play, then I would be pretty sad about it because he can openly challenge my Solari Priestess. Now, I play my Spring Guardian instead here, and this is a really important distinction to make, especially in this matchup. The difference between playing a Spring Guardian versus a Solari Priestess is that he can't openly challenge my Spring Guardian with his Fiora without playing a spell first, uh, unless he just wants to trade off his Fiora. In this case, especially with his deck, that's not what he's looking to do. And so by essentially playing this Spring Guardian, it's going to deny an attack from his Fiora, unless he chooses to give up his Fleetwing Tracker for it. Now, the reason why this blocks an attack from the Fiora, even though he's at 4 mana, he can still represent a Sharp Sight or a Riposte or a Spirit's Refuge in order to challenge my minion. I have 4 mana, which means that I can choose to play reactively into him. So if he opens with a Riposte to challenge, I have the Mystic Shot to kill his Fiora, or play a Thermo Beam after combat to finish it off. And this is a very key distinction to make, especially in this matchup that you do have to think about. And so I'll resume the video once again. And as I said, he has no attack here, so he passes. And now, importantly, why exactly I run Spring Guardian in this deck, besides it being a good 3-drop, is that it generates a token for me to discard with my Sum Treasure, which I plan on doing this turn. And for the same reason last turn why he couldn't challenge my unit with his Fiora is kind of like the same reason why he can't use his Fiora to block this turn. He would have to play proactively into my units, and then I can use my spells reactively to counter anything that he plays. And that's a very important concept to grasp, especially in this matchup. Now it's his turn. He's at 5 mana, meaning he could play like a Shen or a Screeching Dragon, and he chooses to play the Screeching Dragon. And now, very importantly, this drops him to 4 mana, meaning that 3 mana, meaning that he now no longer has access to cards like Riposte, Spirit's Refuge, or Deny, meaning that he can only play Notify or Sharp Sight. And me being at 5 mana means that if I choose to play a 5 mana Thermo Beam on his Fiora, it's guaranteed to kill the Fiora. But in this case, I actually opt to use the Thermo Beam because, importantly, he can't deny this this Tri-Beam. Later down in the matchup, if he denies like a Tri-Beam, which is not only removal, but actually gives me a unit on board, that could be really devastating. And so I choose to opt to use this Tri-Beam while he's under deny. And if he uses a Sharp Sight in a defensive manner to protect a unit, then that's not as bad as if he used it during combat to get a favorable trade. And so he starts off his attack turn by shielding his dragon with a Brightsteel Protector. And I think my turn is pretty simple here. I'm most likely just playing 2 3-drops to buff up my remaining Tri-Beam. But I opt to pass first because this is also a very important lesson about initiative. He protected his dragon with a shield, and so I'm pretty confident that he's committing to an attack here. So I want to wait until after he attacks before I spend a good portion of my mana, because if he decided to develop another unit, my turn could change, and I could maybe think about using the Thermo Beam instead if he played like a Shen, for example. But now that he attacked, he didn't develop anything, and so I'm just gonna safely develop 2 3-drops here, I think. Our opponent's thinking about something. It could be, this is like a somewhat advanced hand reading, but he's thinking about a card that he wants to play potentially. And I have to read that he's not gonna play like a single combat in this type of board state, so he's debating on playing a minion this turn. And at 4 mana, that could be a second Fiora or another Shen. And so that's kind of another tip in hand reading. I obviously don't have a great open attack here, so I opt to play the 1 mana Yeti, which is really funny in this certain situation because it's a very cheap way to pass over initiative to our opponent without risking them just ending the round altogether. And he does a pass at 10 mana, which is a little strange. I could be happy ending the round here, and he would burn 1 more mana than me, but I don't think that's necessarily the right play. I could be wrong about that. But based on this play, I think he's either representing a lot of combat tricks that he is waiting for me to open attack with, or he wants me to drop below a certain amount of mana before playing his Shen, for example, this turn. And so he plays his Shen, and that kind of puts me at a bad attack this turn because I'm at 3 mana and he's at 6 mana, meaning that he has access to a lot more cards that he could play this turn to have favorable exchange. And so I only opt to attack with the Elusive Sister. And if he wants to sharp sight into this, then I'm perfectly happy because he's not protecting a super key minion this turn. This is also a kind of an interesting turn coming up. He's debating on how exactly he wants to attack this turn. If he wants to shield the dragon with his Shen, then he's putting his Shen into danger because I have a 5/5 that could easily trade down with it. And if he only attacks with his dragon, then I can Mystic Shot on stack, and he'd have to probably spend more mana than me to counter it. And so he's really debating on how he wants to initiate this attack. And he passes, which is really critical here because we know from the last turn where he passed at 10 mana, he's representing a good amount of combat tricks in hand. And so we don't want to commit unnecessarily into his attack. And well, especially we can't really play any units because our board is full. And so I think that it's in our best interest to pass here and pretty much waste his attack token. We're both burning the same amount of mana. And this turn is also very key because now that he's at 9 mana, he can play Brightsteel Legion, which would grant all of his units barriers. And the moment I pass initiative to him and he jams it down, it completely destroys my attack. I would have to use my spells proactively in order to even pop the barriers, and then he could use like single combats or concerted strikes to take advantage of his barriers before the removal hits on the stack. And so this is the turn where I have to take an open attack. And so his first move is to use the Spirit's Refuge to keep his dragon from taking 5 damage. And I think that the Mystic Shot is valuable enough to pop this blocker because I can follow it up with a Get Excited to kill his Shen or his dragon here. And that's exactly what I do. This Rummage is kind of a dead card. I have very few cards in hand that I am willing to discard. And for those cards that I can discard, I need to save them for my Get Excited. And now, so we trade Get Excited for Notify here, which kind of sucks because I had to discard a card and use my Get Excited, and he only traded it for 1 card. So he's quickly slimming down my card advantage. But it's not really a card I can play around in this aspect, and playing into a card like Notify is a lot safer when it's not during his attack turn. And so now I'm just thinking about it. This Tribeam is getting pretty big, but I can't play it because he has mana up for Deny. And so I opt to play another 3-drop here, which gives me a token to use my Get Excited on. Now, I actually choose to use my Thermal Beam here because it's a little less flexible because it can't be used during combat. and the only card that he could use to prevent it would be a deny, because a sharp sight, or rather, he could have, I guess, another riposte, which would protect it. But in this case, sharp sight wouldn't have protected his Shen. And as I predicted, he drops his Bright Steel formation as soon as he could. And this is where things get a little bit hairy. My removal suddenly becomes a little bit worse. And so I try to fish for an obliterate card here, but to no luck. However, this 3-drop does scale my Tri-Beam, and so it's probably the most useful in this situation. I played it thinking that one of my elusives was safe this turn, which was a misplay as a whole, because his challengers actually grant his units attack bonuses with the leveled up Shen on board. And this is actually probably a pretty big misplay, because if I did have the 3/3 elusive around, this game might be a lot different. And you'll see why in the coming turns. But playing it before he attacked was a misplay. And so he challenges both my elusives. I chump out his Bright Steel, and I don't necessarily want to trade off against this Shen. I'm kind of thinking about, or I'm kind of rationing out how many turns I have left, how many units I need to block his Bright Steel, and knowing the fact that, he doesn't really have a good way of dealing over the top damage. Now, um, uh, I'll have to think about how I'm thinning out this board here. Now, this Tri-Beam's actually at 7, meaning that with both of these Get Excited, I can actually kill the Bright Steel formation with it. And I think that's the line I'm committing to. So my next turns are going to be using these 2 Get Excited to stack up my Tri-Beam. And so I opt to use this first Get Excited on his Screeching Dragon in hopes of killing it. And I think at this point, it's very safe to assume that he has no Sharp Sight and no more Nopifies in his deck. Although I think he was only running 1 Nopify in this version. But he currently, I would say, does not have a Sharp Sight in hand. And so again, our play this turn is simply going to be use Get Excited and then do a 9-mana Tri-Beam onto his Bright Steel, meaning that we have a spare 5 mana to play this turn, and we also have to discard either our Heimer or our Diana. And of course, I opt to discard my Diana instead, because if this Get Excited goes through with a Heimer on board, then I also generate an additional body, which could be used to block. Although I could see a very good argument of doing it the other way around, because a Diana could also challenge one of these Fleetwing trackers. But that's kind of in the past now. But this does actually force out a single combat here just to deny me the minion draw. And he actually taps under deny mana, meaning that I'm safe to play this Tri-Beam, and because we had the read that he didn't have Sharp Sight in the earlier turns, he doesn't have any way to protect his Bright Steel from this turn. And I actually get a Dreadway here, which is fucking nuts, to say the least. This essentially nullifies any blocks that he can make, because all my units can kill any of his units that he chooses to block with. And now if I did have the elusive attacker on board, that would have done an additional 6 damage, which would have allowed me to have the over-the-top win condition with a Mystic Shot. And so I'm really sad that instead I have a vanilla 3/3 here than the elusive. But in the end, it didn't really matter, because he doesn't end up blocking this 3/3, and so I still get 6 damage in this turn. But now we're both at a very low amount of cards, and we're all relying on top decks now. And I get kind of a dead card here. Tri-Beam is kind of like one of those cards I don't want to draw. But what's really funny here is that if he uses his Shen to support his Fiora, because of the support mechanic and the attack order, he would basically give up his Shen to one of my blockers because the Dreadway is still on board. And so this actually forces out a concerted strike once he realizes what's going on here. And I actually get a pool shark, which is really funny because I'm relying on top decks, this pool shark actually gives me an additional draw. But I'm also on a very tight schedule. He has a Fiora Shen combo on board, and after this attack, he's gonna level up Fiora and be 2 out of 4. And so I'm on a very tight schedule here, and I need to be ending this game fast. Once again, I use the pool shark to block the Shen and save around the Spring Guardian in case I somehow get an attack through. And of course, we don't really have a read on what his last card is, and there's no way of really testing to find out here. This pool shark actually draws us a Sump Dredger and a Mountain Goat, which gives us an extra cycle. But we pick up the Solari Priestess, which not only I can't use a Daybreak effect, playing it would just give him a free challenge for this Fiora. And so at this point, I think playing it is a dead card. And so I don't really have an attack either, because if I attack with the 4/3, he has the block from the Shen, which I can't really allow. And so he actually passes too, meaning that he didn't draw a minion, is my guess. So he has 2 spells in hand, and actually I'm not sure which card that was. He might have drawn the River Shaper last turn, but I snap pick this Great Beyond because it's an elusive, and hopefully I can close out the game on my next attack. Now I'm gonna pause the video here again, just to give another recap. I think that picking the Great Beyond here was a misplay, and that I should have picked the Scourge instead. I picked the Great Beyond because I had the read that he didn't have a sharp side in hand, and because it has a spell shield, it would also counter cards like a Concerted Strike. However, I think this was a little short-sighted, because I think that an attack with the Scourge with my Acel on board would have closed the game out guaranteed versus risking the fact that hopefully he didn't draw into a sharp sight in the last few turns. But I'll let the match keep rolling. And again, very critically, after this turn, he's gonna be at 3 out of 4 on his Fiora. This attack here seems kind of risky because if this Solari Priestess were a Mystic Shot instead, he wouldn't have a way to protect his Fiora unless he had a Concerted Strike or something like that. And so I think that he would have been safer challenging the 3/3 instead. Now, my block here is also very telling. And you'll see why as soon as he figures out which unit he wants to challenge. So he does end up challenging the 4/3. And now I could have, maybe even should have blocked the Shen with my Acel, but I need to kill off this 3/3 so that if he draws like a single combat or a Concerted Strike next turn, then he doesn't have a unit to kill with his Fiora. And so it's very important that I sack this this Spring Guardian last turn. And that perhaps also means that he didn't have a Concerted Strike in hand, because if he committed the Concerted Strike, he could have won on that turn. But this Solari Priestess could have been a Mystic Shot, so maybe he was still holding back. But I commit to this attack hoping that it'll close out the game. And well, you'll see exactly why I should have picked the Scourge, because he actually did top deck exactly his sharp sight, as you can see any moment now. Sorry, I kind of spoiled the surprise thinking that this would be a little sooner, but he snaps the sharp sight top deck onto the River Shaper, and I am shaking right now because his Fiora is 3 out of 4, and with the Shen, he gets to challenge my Great Beyond and kill it. And if he does kill it, then I just lose the game. And so he passes again. He obviously doesn't want to play anything big in fears of me having a way of stopping it. And I actually draw this Hush, which is so huge because not only does this threaten the Fiora, because it'll strip the barrier off of it. Uh, if he actually kills my unit with his Fiora this turn, he doesn't get the progress towards the Fiora win condition. And so this is kind of like a double-edged sword for him. But because he had the River Shapers on board, he manages to draw into a Riposte, which keeps his Fiora alive. But isn't the worst because I know we're both low on cards, and once I jam this Scourge on the next turn, I have a pretty good open attack that will hopefully lead me to victory. And if he chooses a single combat my Scourge this turn with the Fiora, or even commit a Concerted Strike this turn, then getting the kill with the Fiora doesn't actually give him the level up as well. And so he'd be wasting resources, I guess. But so sad is that I'm 1 mana short off of this Moon Glow here, which would have won me the game. And it doesn't really matter if I played or not here because there's no slow speed removals cards in his deck. So having played it or not didn't matter. But if I did play it last turn, then, or if I could have played it last turn, I would have won the game. And I drag in the 6/6 to allow as much damage to do with my Asoul. And yeah, he top decks a Concerted Strike with his other top deck Thither the Bold on the last turn. And this perfectly lines up against my Scourge. And I desperately fish for a last pale or last Hush in attempts to shut out his Fiora, but to no avail. And the game resolves with him getting his 4th kill with his Fiora. And so this was a really crushing defeat. I probably misplayed on the turn where I chose the Great Beyond rather than the Scourge because he never had a sharp sight up to this point. But I can never play around a sharp sight that he top decked, but the Scourge was probably still a safer play. Overall, he had a much better top deck over the past few turns that allow him to win the game, and that's sometimes just how card games roll.